Okay, so for my topic, I decided to do presentations of social anxiety disorder in specifically women. This is kind of hits home to me just through experience. I haven't been actually diagnosed with social anxiety disorder, but I mean generalized anxiety disorder I have, but this is just kind of like a subcategory. Um, but one of the you know intense fears are often, speaking in front of a group, giving a presentation. So doing this presentation has been really interesting because I could already feel the dread and the anxiety and, the sweating and just I've been thinking about it constantly of doing this presentation. So it kind of hit home for me a little bit here. But so, what is social anxiety disorder? So, it is characterized as persistent fear of one or more social or performance situations in which a person is exposed to unfamiliar people or surroundings and exposed to possible scrutiny by others. This individual fears that he or she will act in a way or show anxiety symptoms that will be embarrassing or humiliating and or humiliating. These could be, the symptoms are normally associated with general anxiety, like intense fear, sweating, dry throat, dry mouth, difficulties speaking, difficulties swallowing, and even a racing heartbeat. Um, a lot of times, these social anxieties occur in, like fear of speaking in front of groups, being introduced to other people, being the center of attention, walking into a room where everyone else is already sitting down, just being watched while completing a task, and even just your overall self image, comparing yourself to others consistently all the time, especially when you walk into the room, you're comparing yourself to the other people in the room. It gets that intense often. So, this little character picture here says social anxiety sucks, which it really, really does. And so the little guy in the picture is kind of, sitting there. Someone's asking if they know the answer to the question. And oftentimes it's like you may know the answer to the question, but you're afraid to raise your hand and speak up because you're afraid to have all of those eyes laid on you, that you're going to mess up, that you don't know what you're talking about, that you're not confident in your abilities, and it gets really intense. Like you just start overthinking and many thoughts start flying through your mind and everything like that. And it just gets really, really overwhelming for that person in that situation. So for the prevalence, 15.5% of women are often diagnosed with social anxiety disorder versus 11.1% of men. I think this was done in 2017 from the information that I found. But it did say that over time, women were more inclined to be diagnosed with social anxiety disorder specifically, um, just over time and through experiences. Um, One thing that I didn't really focus on was teenage girls, which probably could have given me more information. With the greater prevalence difference here, with 11.2% of teenage girls versus 7% of teenage boys being diagnosed with social anxiety disorder. And that obviously kind of makes sense, especially when you're a teenager. You're kind of going through those changes. You're figuring out who you are. You're figuring out what you like, who you want to be. Basically, it's just a really difficult time. And during that process, especially nowadays with social media, a lot of girls have a lot of outlets and things to compare themselves to. Like there's always, all of the social media outlets, especially, TikTok, everything like that. Girls have just continuously have reasons to compare themselves to other girls, wondering why they aren't good enough. Why don't they have this? Why can't they be like this person? Why can't they, have the fame, like like a TikTok star? Like I know I see a lot of teenage girls in TikTok these days, which can get really overwhelming and really frustrating and cause a lot of anxiety to develop in those early years. Um, and it's also estimated that 12.1% of US adults in general will experience social anxiety disorder at some point in their lifetime. And it's obvious that many of us will experience some form of social anxiety. There's always going to be that one stipulation of one situation that's really fearful for you. Like for me, it's honestly giving a presentation or just speaking in class. But there's always going to be just a specific experience or situation that may cause more anxiety for you, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have social anxiety disorder. Um, so to move to disparities, one of the interesting things that I found was the femininity versus masculinity, and how gender role identification between women and men, which I know is kind of on a construct, a whole um, wheel of that. But over the decade, the gender role identification, women were meant to stay in the home and be stay-at-home mothers and clean the house and not really go out and be in social situations. And men were the ones that were social. They were the ones getting out into those environments and putting their face out there and being in public and everything like that. But we see that now in recent times that it's kind of, women are doing more of what men used to do. Like the roles are kind of flipping, or they're kind of equalizing. Um, so the research that I was finding is that, obviously women were associated with shyness and submission, and men were more associated with aggression and dominance. Um, and so it basically was stating that a traditionally masculine orientation was found to be linked with a decreased risk of diagnosis with social anxiety disorder, because they're already exposing themselves and being in front of these groups of people and putting their face out there, and not comparing themselves to other people, and not worried about their self-image as much as what it would be for women, especially during those times when they're normally at home and not out associating with other people as often. Um, the concern for traditionally feminine orientation is the concept of basically being placed in situations that may generate higher levels of intense fear and debilitation, which is basically what I just said. Um, Another disparity that I was finding, like a greater difference between women, especially for women, was the self-image concept and the interactions with the opposite sex. Um, I found a study that focused on the experience of patients with social phobia, is what it labeled, but obviously social anxiety disorder, and the correlation of negative self images. Now, this one didn't directly analyze women specifically, but it just kind of links with that gender role identification that, women were more afraid to be in social situations, or not that they were more afraid to be in social situations, but that it was becoming more of a barrier because they weren't used to it, and they were constantly, having to um, put on that face up, that makeup, dress a certain way, having those standards that society has met, or at least created for women, and not really created for men. Men had more of a laid back perception to them, other than, having the dominance, being that, aggressive, intimidating face all the time. So with the study, there was a correlation of negative self-images and performing poorly when in a feared social situation. So if a person had social anxiety disorder in this study, um, they held a negative self-image in mind when holding a conversation with a selected volunteer for this study. And so after the conversation, the discussion was that the feelings reported were associated with being more anxious, and believed that they had done a poor performance, that they hadn't actually held a decent conversation with this individual. And it was also observed by the volunteer that through the conversation, the participant had demonstrated changes in behavior, or frequent changes in behavior, just kind of seemed, a lot more like just not present in the conversation, and that they presented with more symptoms of anxiety. The second conversation with the participant relied on forming a more of a controlled image in their head, instead of rather that negative self-image. And obviously there was a change, after the conversation. They felt less anxious, and the volunteer obviously could tell a difference in that they were more present in the conversation, and they felt more comfortable, rather than focusing on, looking like they just weren't together, basically. And so this little blip would just gives like a list of things that people with social anxiety often do. They, go to the bathroom to escape from that situation, or, they feel very uncomfortable without having a phone or just some other crutch, which is really interesting. Like that phone can be that crutch oftentimes because it's something that they can just kind of disconnect and get into if they're in an uncomfortable situation, or dwell in a small awkward moment for much longer than necessary. Never go to a social event without a person that makes you feel comfortable. Always have that, crutch. That person is basically that crutch to help you make you feel comfortable in that situation. Um, you become dependent on that person, so you follow them way too much. You worry about that person beginning to find or to you're worried about that person finding you too anxious or too obnoxious or too annoying. You can fake an illness to get out of a social event that makes you uncomfortable, and you don't buy something necessary because the cashier is intimidating, or just that situation in general is intimidating. The analysis part. So basically, cultural variations with analysis of social anxiety and presentation in women are, kind of different for women than for men, which I found in one research study that I found. It identified that the situations feared by women, which included speaking in front of an audience, being observed while working, entering a room when others have already been seated, being the center of attention, interacting with an authority figure that's intimidating, and even just expressing disagreement and causing, an altercation. If something makes you uncomfortable, you're just afraid to actually, disagree with somebody. And the information found in this suggested that women tend to have a wider range of social situations that were anxiety inducing. Um, and this was potentially influenced by the change of gender roles over the last decade. And it obviously, men do have a higher rates of, anxiety inducing situation in other areas, but overall women had more. Um, and so for cultural bias, it's kind of the impacts of society on the expectations of women is what I tried to focus on, but there was it was very difficult to find the information that I wanted. Um, so for one of the studies that I found kind of was similar to the one in the disparities that I addressed. It was specifically focused on women that had social anxiety disorder, and how they were, it just kind of showed how they acted when they were video chatting an attractive male. And through that process, there was a video that showed their face as well as, the picture of the male. So it showed the concern, of the woman being too focused on her self-image while being in front of this male. Like oftentimes they present with high anxiety, they're acting really nervous, they're acting, I hate using the term quirky, but they're acting just really off-centered. They're not seeming as present, in the conversation. And so what I wanted to really focus on was what has caused for women to have that type of, expectation that they need to be 100% at all times. They need to look a certain way to just be attractive, when they really should just focus on being themselves and just kind of, going with the flow of the conversation. But there wasn't really a lot of information. But in the study, it ended up telling how if there was no instruction with asking questions, the focus became more on to the image of the female. Like she became more focused on herself in the video. But when there were more questions, like when there was a guided questionnaire, they were able to seem less anxious and focus on having that conversation with that male. So that bias of like women should always look a certain way, act a certain way, especially in front of men, which was obviously created by society over the last decade, has really made an impact on, just the self-image of women and how social anxiety disorder affects them. So for summary and implications, it just kind of was just difficult because I wasn't able to find as much information that I wanted to, specifically tailored to women, and especially with the implications of social media. So oftentimes we just have